So without anything further, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Geoff Mayfield.
Okay, quick bio that Aaron told me to give you. I was at Billboard for a long time. Some of our students had not been born yet when I started at Billboard. I was there for 23 years. I was a columnist for a long time, started as retail editor, was later director of the charts department. So I was there for that period of time and then left there in 2008 to join Universal Music Group Distribution, where I was vice president of business analysis and market research. I've been consulting the last 3 years, and I'm really thrilled to be joining the team here at the Los Angeles College of Music, which, convenient for me, is in my backyard, Pasadena. But this isn't about me. This is about our esteemed guests tonight, so I want to introduce them to you right now. Starting with someone who I worked with at Universal Music. He was VP of National Accounts there. Now he's the Senior VP of Label Sales for Capitol Music Group. They've got acts like Katy Perry, Beck, Sam Smith you might have heard of, 5 Seconds of Summer, Halsey. I'm more keenly aware of the fact that Vince is a married man than I am most people because I had the honor of officiating his wedding. Please join me in welcoming Vince Sidlowski. By the way, I still have that license, so if anyone here has that need, see me after. Next, we bring you someone whose name is often mispronounced. Oh, also, by the way, Vince and Stephanie are the parents proud parents of an unlikely named cat named Godzilla, who looks way too sweet to have that name. Mara Schwartz Kugi. Now, when I first met Mara, she didn't have a Kugi at the end of her name. She just recently got married. She's actually added a couple of critters to her life. One is her husband, and then the two of them, who are cat people, added a dog to their lives as well.
This is true.
But the bigger reason I invited her here has nothing to do with pets. It has to do with the fact that she is the founder and president of her own publishing company after having a distinguished career at Bug Music, which later became part of BMG. Among the acts she's worked with would be Bananarama, Scott Weiland, The National, Grizzly Bear, and M. Ward. So please join me in welcoming Mara Schwartz Kugi. Charlie, I've known for a long time. He was, as long as I knew him, or actually when I met him, and there for almost 20 years, he was one of the marketing directors at the Disney Music Group, not just working with the Disney label, but with their pop label, Hollywood Records. He worked with Queen extensively when they became an essential part of the Hollywood catalog, worked with developing acts like Fastball and I didn't really find out until later that when there was that really cool comeback career for Tony Bennett in the 90s, when Tony Bennett was appearing on the MTV Awards and stuff like that, Charlie actually had his fingerprints in that when he was working at Sony. And now he has his own music and management companies, music and marketing company, which among other things is working with Taylor Hackford, the gentleman who did the great Oscar-winning film about Ray Charles. He's now working on a movie about Louis Prima and Killy Smith, so Charles is working on that. He's also working on Neil McCoy, a country artist who some of you may have heard of, is going to do a do-it-yourself album, an independent album, and that's going to be coming. And Steve Tyrell. Any of you guys listen to K-Jazz here in town? The guy who's on the evenings who does a lot of the vocal music because he's a jazz singer, Steve Tyrell. Charlie works with him as well. So please welcome my dear friend Charlie Datry. And as well as I know Charlie, I honestly don't know what kind of pets he has, but here's what I can tell you. He has 3 of the most polished, well-behaved children you have ever met. So that's something to be proud of in and of itself. You can tell me about your pets later. So we promised to give you in the materials that brought you here an update on what's happening with streaming music. It seems like almost every week since the end of last year, there's a new story developing about streaming music. It's become more and more the way that consumers are accessing music. And so since a lot of you are aspiring musicians, you're going to want to know about the marketplace that you're getting into. And so we're going to give you an idea. And to give you an example, I just finished working on this presentation that we're going to share with you end of last week, and like some stories broke over the weekend that we had to add to this. But let's just set the pace for you. And panel, what I'll tell you is as I'm going along here, if you have any observations to throw in, you don't have to wait for me to ask for you. And if not, I might just call on you anyway. But the first thing I want you to realize, here's a couple of headlines that came out last fall when streaming overcame there could have been a decline at Warner Music had it not been for the fact that there had been streaming. The biggest news to come out of Warner's latest 12-month results was this. 2015 was the first full year in which streaming revenues outperformed download income. And they were the first major to report such a breakthrough. But they weren't alone. Pretty soon, Universal had the same kind of financial results. That first headline you see where we talk about their increase came from a Music Business Worldwide newsletter in November. And then in the 19th, that second headline came where both Sony and Universal, two of your majors, were both reporting great race to rely on streaming, with both companies reporting 24% of their income coming from that channel. The IFPI, which is the International Trade Group, and they talked about the fact that we had a global music increase in revenue of 3.2%, which is significant in itself because since the early 2000s, the industry has had lots of years of decline. So the fact that we had a global increase was really significant. And you can see there, digital sales contributing 45% of industry revenues, and streaming revenue being a big part of that, as it was up 45.2% over the previous year. Happening here in the U.S., that first headline is from Billboard. U.S. recording industry sees slight uptick in revenue, and streaming dominates digital. And in those statistics there, those graphs, the one on the far left, that would be your on-demand streaming. That would be your Spotify, that would be your Apple Music, that would be your Rhapsody, the ones where you go in and you decide what you want to listen to as opposed to Pandora and the other internet radio services. Those would be more reflected in what you're seeing there in the middle, the sound exchange. And then on-demand ad-supported, the one way over to the right that doesn't make as much money, that would be people who go to YouTube to listen to music. So that bucket there, the on-demand, that would be when people go to YouTube to listen to music, and it just doesn't, even though there's a really, really large audience that does that, it doesn't generate as much revenue for record companies and artists. The biggest of the on-demand streamers is called Spotify. They were launched in Sweden in 2008. Their U.S. launch was here in July 2011. That is also the same date when CFOs, Chief Financial Officers in the U.S. started paying attention to how streaming deals are structured. They currently have, as far as we know, they don't always update us on numbers, but the latest estimate I've seen, 100 million users, that includes the people who have their free service. And then 30 million of those, this is worldwide, are people who pay for Spotify. And catching up very fast, they just announced yesterday Apple Music. They were launched in June of last year, and just yesterday they cited that they had 15 million paid members, and that means that they've averaged about 1 million new subs a month this year. They reached 113 countries earlier this year in their first 8 months, and that includes 59 countries where Spotify is not yet available. A lot of you have heard of Tidal. That was relaunched by Jay-Z. It was actually a company that was already around. He invested in it. There was a big splashy relaunch with a lot of other artists besides Jay who were part of it, including his wife. You may have heard of her, Beyonce. Alicia Keys was there, Rihanna, a lot of key artists who actually have equity in the company. And therefore, one of the ideas is that they will have some exclusives that you can't find anywhere else. And they reported 3 million subscriptions last I saw in March. They haven't reported as frequently as the others. Among the new kids in town, YouTube Red. You get 3 months for 99 cents. That's a deal that they've been doing. This was actually launched in October, and this is YouTube trying to have a paid service. And it's not just for music. It's actually for video content as well. It's only been available in the U.S., Australia, and New Zealand. And they're seeking to capitalize on a huge audience. Like we're talking about millions of people at Apple. This is an audience of billions. Actually 1 billion, that's enough, right? New Kids in Town also includes SoundCloud, which is a service I'm sure a lot of you use to share your music with people. And they were kind of in Dutch with the major record companies for a while because there was some unauthorized content showing up there, but they came to terms. The last one that they came to terms with was Sony, who was actually suing them. But they now have deals with each of the majors and launched a paid service in March called SoundCloud Go. And the other thing, this is another service which is going to try to capitalize on the large audience they got from a free market. Amazon has a different spin on things, and theirs is Amazon Prime. They have over 1 million songs, they have about 1 million songs, so it's a much smaller menu, but you're not really paying for that. Amazon Prime is you pay to be a member of Amazon Prime, and you get free shipping, whether you're ordering diapers or music or what have you, and among the services are video, and you have your Prime Music. It was just launched in the UK last year, but the bigger headline just happened over the weekend, and that is that they are prepping their own on-demand service, so you won't have to be an Amazon Prime member to get access to this much larger menu of songs. And then another company would say, hey, don't forget about us, because they're actually the first of the major streamers. They don't have as large an audience as the rest. They have 3.5 million, but it's worth noting that they're approaching their 15th anniversary. So Rhapsody has been an important player in the market and remains so. And then among the ones coming, a lot of you know about Pandora. This is an internet radio service. But the reason we mention them here is that they bought the assets of a bankrupt streaming company called RDO. And so that and the fact that they've reached some major deals with some of the large publishers indicates that they're not only planning to start an on-demand service, but they want to do it on a global basis. So right now, they're only doing business in 3 countries as well, U.S. being their largest one, but they want to take the substantial number of listeners they have. They have over 81 million users. They want to take that audience and try to make something of their on-demand service. And this next one, I'm going to actually kind of lean on Vince to add some color, because I don't know as much about it, but I do know that Vince and I have kind of a vested interest in Cure Media because one of our old bosses has just become interim president of that company. And what's intriguing about them is they're going to have a smaller menu of songs, but if you'll notice, most of the streaming services charge $9.99 a month. They want to have a service that starts at $1.99 and another tier at $4.99. So I'm not quite sure how they can pull that off. Vince, have you heard anything about how this will differ from the conventional streaming companies?
I haven't really heard too much about it other than the announcement that our former boss is now their interim CEO. But it'll be interesting to see how the higher-ups and all 3 of the majors deal with this pricing tier request that they're doing. And but I don't know the details of each of those pricing tiers. I don't know that that's been revealed outside of the discussions with the majors.
Yeah, I know one component they plan to have will be the ability to share songs, but I mean, you can already kind of do that with some of the other streaming services as well. So that kind of sets the stage for you in terms of who the players are. And now we're going to start to turn to our panel as we get into some of the issues that are with us. But before we do that, I'd just like to ask, starting with Vince, and we'll work our way up, to get their observations of streaming in the marketplace and how that plays in what they do for a living. So Vince, we'll start with you.
Well, I think Aaron said it in the beginning. We are in a very exciting time in the music industry, and that change is happening at a much accelerated pace than ever before, where we throughout history would go into 10 to 15 to 20 year periods where formats would evolve and then eventually turn into, the vinyl record turned into a CD, then turned into download. Those were 10-year periods. We're now in, as Geoff had said, in the streaming world. And we're seeing just changes and entries into this marketplace faster than ever before and making very quick headway, making very big headlines, as we've seen with Tidal and their approach to coming to market, and Apple Music certainly bringing their weight to the market. And it makes my job exciting and challenging at times. We're always watching each Friday to see what artist has done what to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. And they've certainly done that more so in the streaming world than ever before. And, you know, the consumer clearly has made a decision that that they're moving more towards the streaming model, that ownership is not everything that makes up their consumption of music, and we support that with Capital at Capital, and that, you know, the different areas, the different means of consumption, we look to all those different areas, whether it's physical, download, streaming, or other, because our artists demand that of us, and we want to make sure that we're capitalizing on all those different revenue sources for them, and making sure that what's good for one is not always the right thing for another, and each individual artist, we take a very tailored approach to bringing them to marketplace, and streaming is now becoming, you know, the predominant stream for doing that.
Now, you set the table for us nicely, Vince, and one thing I want to emphasize that he said, which is this is consumer driven. A lot of things that happen in music, you know, record company executives try to bend the marketplace, but the consumer overall is really the one who's going to decide what's going to happen. And sometimes it takes longer for the consumer to be heard than others, but that's really what pushes a lot of the changes that we're experiencing. Now, a lot of the contentions that have come up, and one of the reasons that Aaron really wanted to make sure that we had publishing represented here, has to do with how publishing is floating in this business, how it resides in the streaming world. So even though Mara has a lot to do with syncs, and we might have a chance to talk about that later, she is a publisher, and she also worked with a big publishing company. So I kind of wanted to get your perspective as far as what are some of the hot button issues with publishing and the way in which publishers and songwriters are being paid in streaming.
Well, first of all, I personally love streaming. I mean, I think it's fantastic on all different levels. The access that you get to music, you know, you can check out anything you want. If you don't like it, you can turn it off. You can turn, you know, it's not like the old days where I'd have to like go flip a record over, you know. It makes it a lot easier to access music and be exposed to a lot more music. The problem from a publisher's perspective is that in the days of record purchases, there's a set mechanical royalty which the publisher, and then, you know, a portion goes to the songwriter of that, the publisher would receive, and that was mandated by the Copyright Office. And the number, you know, changes and goes up every now and then, but the basic mechanical royalty for a download or for a CD is 9.1 something or other cents. It's one of those numbers like pi, where it's like 9.1413 or whatever, per song. With streaming, it's been kind of like the Wild West. There hasn't been a proper rate set, and a lot of the companies, I mean, even including Spotify and the big ones, have launched their company, kind of said, hey, look, this is what we're going to be paying you, and, you know, take it or leave it. And there's not really as you know, that much of a choice. I mean, people want their music on Spotify. Labels want music on Spotify. We are losing the money from mechanicals anyway, because people are not buying CDs and downloading like they used to. But we're kind of stuck in this where there hasn't really been a rate established via any kind of, you know, court and a Copyright Office or anything for us to be paid. And the amount is significantly smaller what we get paid per stream. I mean, it's basically a fraction of a cent per stream. There's also been a few problems in just which it doesn't seem like this should be a problem. It seemed like everything should be digitally just set up. All the songwriters and what percentage they have of every song is kind of set up in the system, and it's digital and it just flows through. But for whatever reasons, a lot of these bigger streaming companies have seemed to have trouble accessing this information and have not been paying the writers through because they're saying that they can't find all the shareholders or something's under dispute or whatever excuse they're giving. You may have heard about David Lowery, who is currently in a big, from the band Cracker, who's in a lawsuit, or he's basically set up a class action suit against Pandora, which is exactly what it is he's fighting. He's saying, look, you guys have been saying for 4 years or however many years that Cracker and Camper Van Beethoven songs have been up there that you can't find me and you haven't been able to pay me. The problem with your argument is I've been suing you for 2 years, so you obviously have my address and can find me. So there's no reason for you to be not paying me. And just recently, a couple of developments have come up in this space. One of them is that some of the streaming services have been including what has been nicknamed the Lowry Clause, which to me at first I thought, great, they're taking David Lowery seriously. And it's like, yes, they are. Now they're putting in a clause so that if you have your music up on that service, you agree not to sue if you don't get paid. So that's not really that helpful. But also, literally just yesterday, there was an announcement, and you guys may know a little bit about this. It's technology from Berkeley, the music school in Boston, which is going to be a pretty large repository of this information so that it's going to be a more streamlined process for the streaming services to find the rights holders and pay. And that's one thing a lot of people, ASCAP, and a lot of people have been asking for a long time. This information is all out there. Let's get it all in one place. It's really kind of piecemeal right now to find out who wrote a song or, who's the rights holders and things like that. So that is a long way of saying streaming is great, publishers are not getting paid nearly as much because of that, and our revenues are going down even though people are listening to music probably more than ever before.
Streaming is great from a consumer point of view, but you have to understand that in the music business, it's always been true, but it's never been more clear. There are at least two distinct businesses that are only somewhat related. There's the developing artist business, which is you're trying to build an audience and you're trying to get exposure. And there you just want to go where everybody is, and everybody is where stuff is free, of course. Then there's the established artist who has an audience and who has a income and who has a revenue and who sells things, and it's not clearly a great option. It's a great promotional option, but the fact of the matter is streaming pays crap. Let's be honest. And when you look at these stats, what you need to understand is that streaming has destroyed the download business, which was a diminishment of the physical goods business. So as their revenue's gone past it, you have to look at, well, what has that revenue substituted for? If I'm Universal Music and I have 35% of the music business, well, I've got 35% of a $10 billion business worldwide, or whatever that is. So I'm getting a check for $250 million a year. If I'm a particular platinum artist, I've seen my recorded music income go down like this. The challenge, and the reason why, and I don't want to leap into the YouTube subject, but YouTube was set up, the initial approach from record labels was that this is a fantastic promotional tool, which it is. But the revenue has been challenged for a long time there. Vivo was set up by, I believe it was Doug Morris when he was at Universal, because at the time, YouTube was doing a terrible job of selling. If you're going to base your product on advertising sales, you have to have a great advertising sales effort. And YouTube has sucked, to be honest. Vivo showed that clearly, where for a number of years, it was clearly in the artist's interest to have your music video on Vivo and not on YouTube. At the same time, because YouTube has ubiquity, and because they are the best source to find everything, that has tremendous attraction to the consumer. So over time, that has to work out. And the reason why they're all getting beat on is the most glaring example of an on-demand service. As Spotify has come up, and Spotify is a European-based company, and I don't think you can discount European nationalism in Spotify's drumbeat of importance in the music business. But the reality is that YouTube's numbers dwarf what Spotify does, because YouTube's been driven by the United States, still the biggest music market in the world, and as they've spread throughout the world, what happens with YouTube has a tremendous impact. So,
now, a couple things to keep in mind. Mara pointed out that things are more complicated in streaming. First of all, the deals themselves, the deal that Universal Music Group has, or the deal that an independent distributor might have, are way more complicated than, okay, you sold something and you're going to get this much part of it. They're set up according to market share. So if a major hits a certain target, they get paid this way, and if they don't hit that, they get paid another way. So there's literally 3 different ways in which a record company gets paid. There's 2 or 3 different ways in which a publisher gets paid. Then on top of that, in the U.S., for whatever reason, powers that be decided that the record companies would take care of making sure the publishers get paid. It's not like that in Europe, or actually most territories outside the U.S. Apple, for iTunes, took care of publishing themselves. The record company didn't have to worry about that. Same thing with streaming. Ex-U.S., outside the U.S., Spotify pays the publisher directly. So there's a degree more transparency than what we have here, where and that's not saying the record companies are hoarding money or anything like that. It's just a more complicated system. So Mara did point out this quest for a global database, if you will, is a really promising development, because in addition to having a leading academic school behind it, I read the list of the different associations and record companies that are putting into it. All the majors are in it, and it really looks like a really promising venture to help demystify, who should get paid. But those are some of the things that have made things complicated. I want to move ahead to some of the other, and this is actually what Charlie was talking about. It's called the value gap, and that's just to give you an idea of what Charlie was mentioning. There are $385 million paid from the likes of YouTube, but you're talking about a $7 billion business. And compare that to what Jimmy Iovine used to run Interscope Records, and he's now been part of Apple for a while. He's the one who helped engineer Apple Music. He suggested that YouTube may account for about 40% of music listening, but only 4% of revenue. And the numbers kind of back that up. So there's a big discrepancy between how many people are engaging and the money that's coming in from it. Here's a quote from Sony Music, and I can't say it better than him, so I'll just read what he said. Berger spoke with the biggest group of music companies, the 900 million music fans that use user upload services who generate $630 million for the global music industry each year, but who provide just 4% of industry revenues in 2004. In contrast, 68 million paying subscribers signed up for the likes of Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music, generating $2 billion a year in revenue. So that's the issue that Charlie was just talking about.
Just to jump in there again, so you have to understand there's a compelling consumer desire to have ubiquity. I want to hear the latest Beyonce track, and I want to hear some old Dean Martin TV performance in the same session where it happens to suit my mood. I can find that at YouTube. I would have a hard time finding those 2 things at almost any other streaming service. At the same time, they historically have done a poor job monetizing their audience. So it's a business structure problem that I don't know that YouTube has the solution. They may get, because they have greater resources as part of Google, this may ultimately wind up with a compromise where they just raise their revenue and payouts in some way, because I don't see what we've lost, in particular in California, but 20 years ago, you'd walk into a major record store and you could get, or they could get for you, anything that was in print, basically. And in this way, YouTube satisfies that. If you're looking for the song, it's there. Looking for Hamilton, it's there. Looking for punk rock, it's there. But most services don't have that. There's gaps in what their repertoire is. So there's a great appeal to the consumer.
Charlie's done a nice job of setting up the next issue I wanted to talk about, and that is the area of exclusives. Now, how many of you are aspiring musicians? How many of you would not mind being either a recording artist or a songwriter whose songs are recorded in that? And don't be shy about it, because we're in a music school. All right, so may you have this decision to think about one day in your career, and that is exclusives. One of the things that's come up since Apple Music launched, and actually it started with the notion that Jay-Z had an artist-owned platform, is the idea that one of these services will have something you can't find anywhere else. Most recently, Beyonce's Lemonade was only available on Tidal. I think you could buy it elsewhere, but you could only stream it at Tidal. Some albums have launched on Tidal. Apple has had some exclusives. And you've also had some artists who say, you know what, I don't want to be on Spotify because of the controversy about whether or not all music should be available in their free tier. So here's just a couple of examples. Right there is if you go to Spotify, and you want to get lemonade, it tells you, well, we're working on it. We hope to have it soon. And then I shared this headline from last summer. Drake found himself in an issue because there was an Apple Music exclusive for his album at that time, but he'd been invited to sing at a charity concert that was going to be streamed on Tidal, and Apple's like, hey, wait a second, you're exclusive with us right now, you can't do that. Similar but different, Coldplay are among the acts who own equity in Tidal, and yet they were offered the opportunity to do an Apple-subsidized music video because they had product placement for Beats product. So here you had a shareholder in one streaming company who was kind of being courted to do an exclusive with another streaming company. So it's getting more complicated. Have you any thoughts about this issue, Vince? As I was thinking today, I think you have dodged this bullet so far. I can't think of any capital acts who have been on the firing line on this.
It comes up in just about every conversation with every artist, and we are closely watching the marketplace and gauging the effectiveness of what's being done. But you're right, and it's capital hasn't really gone down this road yet, but our release schedule hasn't quite hit its stride this year, and in the fall you can bet that these conversations have already started, and it's challenging, it's compelling, and I would caution any artist going down this road that Drake is an act unto himself, and that the results of a Drake exclusive at Apple might not be the same results for another artist in their time of their release cycle and their career. So you kind of have to treat each one individually, and as I mentioned in the beginning, you're tailoring a very large marketplace with a lot of diverse consumption going on and looking for the right combination. That's what the label does. Try to help the artist make an intelligent decision about what's going to be the best way to bring their art to the marketplace.
That's true on new records, but I have to say, from a platinum artist point of view, it's patently false across Universal. The reality is that Universal gets substantial payments from these services. What the artists are trying to do is recapture income for themselves. They're trying to move up the food chain. When they take equity in Tidal, why would Jay-Z do this? One of the biggest rap artists in the history of rap. Why does he do it? Because by owning the service, when you're looking at these services getting valued at $300 million, $500 million, $700 million, and they're watching their IP, their intellectual property, go down in value and income go down year to year, albeit outside Drake, who's phenomenally hot. They're looking at their income going like this. They say, well, what I need to do is move up to where I'm an equity participant in this. If the value is going to go from the venture companies and the public to these businesses that are distributing my music, I need to have a bigger piece of that. And in fairness, that's not a new issue. Frank Sinatra started Reprise in 1960. Because he was unhappy with his treatment of Capitol Records. He and his peers were unhappy with how they were getting paid by Capitol, how they were getting, not to beat on Capitol, but the reality was...
Vince wasn't there yet.
I was just about to say that. I don't know if I was born yet.
Vince drove him out the door. It was terrible. But the reality is that artists feeling like they deserve to get a greater compensation in what their releases help drive is as old as, it probably goes back to Edison. So so now it takes on a digital cast because there's particular pressure on their income, and you've got these new services coming down. Some of these services have not made a dime, yet have existed for over a decade and have valuations in the private or public marketplace of hundreds of millions of dollars. In America, I have always felt, and I'm a fan of Pandora because I was an early adopter, if Pandora had not been a bunch of Silicon Valley engineers who'd come up with a really great algorithm and they had any sense of the way music and artists worked, there never would have been an opportunity for Spotify to come to the country. Pandora's in 80+ million homes. They had an early leader position, but for about 8 years, the first 8 years of their existence, they had no interest. They were true believers in their technology, and they had no interest really in dealing with artists or record labels or having that kind of exchange or communication, and that left the door open for other different wrinkles on digitally delivered music to be delivered to the public. Now they're scrambling to get back what they once had. If 6 years ago they'd come up with an on-demand product, I don't think you'd see some of the other major players having the air in the room for them to compete. But they didn't.
They had no interest in doing that whatsoever, and I know for a fact that they were presented with the idea of doing that, and they just didn't have an interest in doing it. Now, years later, they do. Here's some of the acts who have elected not to be on Spotify. Some of them have to do with the free tier issue. Some of them because they have had exclusives with one service or another. But among them, we mentioned Beyonce. Drake, as Vince just alluded to, has had a more recent album that was exclusive to Apple, but it worked out quite well for him. Radiohead, Gwen Stefani, and Coldplay are among the ones who either were late to Spotify or haven't gone on with their.
Well, Adele. I mean, Adele.
Yeah, well, she's her own story, and we're gonna get to her in a minute.
But I think you look at that list. Who are those? Those are the multi-platinum biggest acts in the world. There's no reason why would you put your whole album on the free tier, which pays you a pittance, versus every other product out there, which pays you a lot more. And because Spotify sees that as a funnel that creates their audience, and of course it is. If something has great value and I can give it away for free, you will beat a path to my door. If I went into the mortgage business tomorrow and banks wanted to charge you an interest rate and I said, you know what, I'm going to give you free money. Of course, I'm going to have a line out the door. For these artists who are defending their businesses, they'd be fools. Taylor Swift would be a fool. Any of these artists. Yet, because at a major label or a major distribution company level, they're making tens of millions of dollars by delivering their catalog. Platinum artists that didn't control their rights, that aren't having contemporary hits, have seen all of their product shoved out into that free tier, and they've been crushed in their recorded music income. So I think these artists are smart to not be in.
Now, just out of curiosity, and I don't want anyone to be shy, how many of you pay for one of the streaming services, whether it's Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, what have you, Rhapsody? Okay, and then how many of you confine your listening to either free Spotify or YouTube or internet radio services like Pandora or iHeart? And how many of you do both? Hold up both hands. All right, next we're going to have you lift up one leg. No, I'm kidding. I just wanted to get an idea of how our audience sits on this. And Charlie, our panel's doing a great job of setting up topics for us before I even asked them to. Taylor Swift, there was a lot of confusion. You know, she wasn't the first person who didn't go on Spotify, but she got more attention. It's like when Radiohead's unhappy with Spotify, that's a story in our business. When Taylor Swift's unhappy about it, it's on the Today Show.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a much bigger story. And so a lot of people didn't understand. The issue was only that she didn't want her album to be available in the free tier where she doesn't get paid as much money. And Spotify's argument, you know, I might as well mention what their argument would be if they were in the room tonight, which is they think the free tier is important for two reasons. One is that that's where they get their paid customers. You come in for the free service, you get tired of the commercials, you're going to say, you know what, and you also want to have better access on your phone. I'm going to go for the paid service. So that's how they're getting people in the door. And the other argument they'll have is that in a digital world where there's so many different ways to just listen to music illicitly or for a much lower compensation on YouTube or what have you, you need to let us have the free service, and it needs to be relatively ubiquitous so that we can get more people into the funnel. So that's what their argument would be. It appeared that once upon a time Sony and Universal were more prone to that argument, and it appears that about 2 years ago, both of those companies have had a reverse and field in their thinking about how that should work. So some of the pressure that we started seeing happening develop late last year was, would they start to allow some artists to say, you know what, this album, or at least some of these songs from this album shouldn't be on the free part. And then Charlie mentioned Adele. She didn't just say no to Spotify, she said no to streaming. And it turned out to be pretty remarkable in that she sold, I mean, I was at Billboard when how many of you remember a group called NSYNC? I was at Billboard when NSYNC sold 2.4 million copies of an album in their first week, and we thought that would never, ever happen again. And so what happened was our industry went through almost 20 years of decline, and Adele, with an album aimed at adults as opposed to kids like NSYNC was, she comes out and she shatters that record. She sold 3.3 million copies of her album the first week it was available in November. And it was not available for streaming except for the first song, Hello. Now, go ahead.
Just to jump in, but understand that the single has always been the stalking horse for an album since the album became the most popular format. So it really is a very interesting and sophisticated approach, in my opinion, of using the same single, which you don't get the same income from, to warm up your audience and introduce them to a particular product, but not giving away that product. And so that really, I thought, was the art of it. They didn't reject streaming out of hand, although that was written in a lot of places. The single, which you can also hear on the radio, you could hear on the radio 10 times a day, if you chose to at the time, was also in the streaming services. If you wanted to, if you were buying into it, and as more singles happen, and certainly Vince can talk to you all day long about the conversion ratio of multiple singles and how that translates to albums, or what a superstar audience means, and how the audience is predisposed to want to buy it. You hear something good, you already have a body of work that you know of, so you have a faith that the rest of the album is going to be good. And so I thought that was a brilliant strategy. I thought they played it as well as they possibly could have and had great visibility at streaming.
A couple of things to note about Adele's approach. One is, this isn't the first time she's done that. Her breakthrough album, which upset the stage for this one, 21, was also kind of brought out on an incremental basis. They didn't put the whole album out at once. They kind of put it out as songs went to radio. They were available in the streaming services. So she's already had kind of a layered approach earlier in her career. And the other thing is, she didn't do, unlike Taylor Swift, who really stuck it to Spotify and said, look, I'm really mad at Spotify, and this isn't how you should do it. And then later when Apple Music launched, Apple had kind of proposed, you know what? When we give consumers a free 3-month window to start, we would like to not pay you. And Taylor complained about that, and then they started at least some sort of token royalty during that 3-month trial. But unlike Taylor, who was very vocal about these issues, Adele just kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, I'm a physical product person. I understand that people like streaming, but she was never really political about expressing her opposition. And in having mentioned Taylor, another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that she's always had kind of a layered approach to streaming herself. When I was at Universal, she was unique in that when a new album came out, usually the only song that was available was the lead single. And then at that point, when the next Taylor Swift album came out, that's when her last album would become available on Rhapsody and the other streaming services that were in the marketplace. So she's already had kind of a layered approach herself.
But before you skip over it, I just want to talk about the complete stones that they have in Silicon Valley. Apple's proposal to the biggest artists in the world, who sell millions and millions of copies of, we want to really be a player in this space. We're going to give your stuff away. You don't participate in our success if we're successful, but our service will be successful, and we'll use your product to make our service successful. And we're not going to compensate you for it. Think about the cojones it takes to make that proposal.
I think it's cojones. But,
I'm sorry.
But yeah, well, that's how they say it in Boston. So we're going to start talking about other revenue channels, but before we do we have any specific questions about streaming? By the way, spoiler alert, if you're wondering if you're one of these artists who should bypass streaming, I would say no. If you're a brand new artist, you want to be on there. Black Keys was an early act who didn't do Spotify, and even they said, you know what, we can afford to not do it. But if I were a new act, I would have to do it. You want to be everywhere you can be. Charlie talked about the promotional oomph of being on YouTube, which has 1 billion users. So at this point in your career, you don't have to worry about that decision.
Oh, no. When you're building an audience, just to be clear, we're talking about artists who have audiences. If you're trying to build an audience, you need to go where the audience is. Frankly, that could be collegehumor.com. Anywhere you get your music exposed. If you're a developing artist, that's all about making good music and getting people to hear it. And getting people to hear it, a major part of it has to be online in this day and age.
So are there any general questions about streaming? Yes, sir. Oh, sure. The question, I'll repeat the question so you can hear. And he wanted to know what the impact would be of boosting the overall paid subscriptions in streaming. And that's what everyone's aiming for. So, Vince, let's start with you.
Well, clearly, from a label perspective, music has value. The decisions in terms of, how we get to that level of paid is well above my pay grade, but clearly it's where we need to head as an industry for our longevity.
And Mara, I guess the obvious thing from the point of view of publishers and songwriters is if there's more pay coming from a paid tier, then that's better for that sector of the market.
Well, yeah, in theory, I mean, if we're not really getting any more per song, there are some, proposals now, most particularly one called the Songwriters Equity Act, which is being really championed by ASCAP and BMI and CSAC. But when a lot of the rates, or even the mechanical rates and things like that were set, they were set by something called a consent decree, which was kind of an agreement between the two sides, and it was literally set before recorded music was even a thing. And they always joke about player piano rolls, like that's how far back it was when some of these rates were decided. And then the streaming rates are even lower than that. So once some of these things start coming before the Copyright Office and we do start getting some better rates that are negotiated more fairly between the two sides, we will start seeing more money. But I think on the publisher side, right now the bigger fight is to get us paid more fairly per song that's streamed, rather than increasing the number of streams or what is paid into the streaming services. We're just trying to get our fair portion of that.
It's the only way this model works. If more people don't convert to paid subscriptions, what you'll see is greater and greater artists falling out of participating in the lower tiers unless some magic advertising revolution happens. And, there are, now and then there's a spot of optimism. Again, I cited Vivo before because Vivo got a far higher per listener and per measurement sale value to their advertising that their advertising team was getting versus what YouTube was getting. It was a subject of great embarrassment at YouTube because YouTube is an equity participant in Vivo along with several of the major record organizations. But the reality is that if more people don't pay, there won't be free because there's no future in it.
Just out of curiosity, I know all of you know about YouTube. How many of you were aware of the name Vivo before we walked in this room tonight? Okay, so Charlie did mention Doug Morris. It was actually Universal Music and Sony who elected to start it. And it started during the time I was at Universal Music. So Sony and Universal were stakeholders in it. EMI was still a separate company. They never came in, although I think they participated. Warner is the most notable of the four majors at that point who didn't come in. They decided to go ahead and continue their existing relationship with YouTube. But the idea was, when YouTube started, they started this thing, and then afterward they kind of came to the music industry and said, well, here's how we're going to pay you. And the music industry was kind of smart, and he's like, hey, wait a second. You use our content to reach this level of success, and it's, to this day, it's still, the traffic builder for YouTube. But those rates were, kind of, Mara talked about the piano rolls. It was kind of the same thing here. It's like, well, here's what you get. You had that, plus you also had this pressure of like, yeah, I'd like to get paid more, but I also know that when my artist has a video on YouTube, I get certain benefit out of that. So, on one hand, they wanted to play tough and try to get better compensation. On the other hand, they've been kind of shy about rattling that cage because, there's a certain value to having 1 billion people looking at your assets. So
This is the thing, and this comes up often in sync world. Everybody is willing to cut corners in one area to make sure that there's exposure so that you can make your revenue in another area, but then that area is also cut corners. And a perfect example in sync is that everybody wants to get their music synced because they think that if they get a good placement on a good TV show, then they'll sell more records or CDs or get more streams. But the problem is that people are willing to give their music away a lot of times very cheaply for sync because they think they're going to get more money from streams, and then you go over to streams, and then that's cheap because they'll say, oh, that's good promotional value, but once you're big, you'll get some syncs. So it's kind of this back and forth of passing the buck, so nobody actually wants to pay for anything.
And it's where streaming's had such an impact, and in a way, it shows you just the changes in the 10 years approximately YouTube's been around. Initially, YouTube was really like a very interesting, highly popular way to get music exposed. What you were going to make money on your downloads, what you were going to make money on your CD sales, what you were going to get money in your physical market. But now, if that just leads to the person going over to Spotify and listening to it on the free tier, as Amaro said, you then still aren't making any money. So at that point, all of a sudden then the attention comes back to YouTube and says, well, now, if you're really an on-demand streaming service, this is what those services pay. And you're not paying anywhere near that, and it's causing the tension and the headlines that you see in the music trades now.
And the last answer to your question, although they are often portrayed as gee, we wish they paid more, do keep in mind that while there is some concern about the levels of compensation that certain artists and certain songwriters get, the business model for companies like Spotify and Apple Music and the other ones we've talked about tonight, they're already turning over 70, 71, 71.5% of their revenue back to rights holders. Now, it may be that they could do that more efficiently than they do it. It may be that there might be better ways that they could calculate it than they do it, but they're already giving a significant amount of the revenue back that they have coming in. So there's only so much room they have to play with. And the other thing you're talking about is in most cases, companies that have not made money yet. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, yeah, it's horrible. But Amazon was around a long time before they ever made money. They were around a long time before they ever turned profit. So that could come. That will come. But that's another thing to keep in mind as we go through this. Any other questions about streaming before? Yes, sir.
Have you heard about the theory that if we reach 100 million paid subscriptions, the general business would finally balance more even? I heard that.
Yeah, he has heard a theory that if we reach 100 million paid subscribers, that would resume some of the revenue that we used to get when we were more of a sales industry than we have now.
It's true. It's true. And if that number happens, you will see a much healthier business, and you will see those kind of things. The fact of the matter is, in some ways, the music business would like to be like the golden age of cable that everybody's cutting the cord on now, which is the sense that everybody bought a package. If you bought a package with your phone and it just comes with music, then you wouldn't have to pay very much every month. But if everybody did it, the revenue would be phenomenal. The best business and entertainment to be in for the last 15 years, and it's ending, was the cable business. Everybody who had a cable network added a couple of others because when the digital tier came in, they had the distribution space, and everybody made, any of these B and C cable channels made $80, $100 million. They do their programming for 40 or 50 million. You do 10 of them, you just made $500 million. It's a simple, clear business that had a home that's currently falling apart.
And then the other thing to keep in mind, to put a bow on your question, is Spotify has done some really aggressive investment raising in the past few months to the level of about $1 billion, and they've set this investment up in a kind of a risky manner that if they aren't able to go public by the end of this year, then those companies that have invested in this round really get a handsome payoff later. So it's in their interest to try to pull off a stock offering before the end of the year, or they have a real serious leverage situation. So they have motivation to try to make this happen, and they've made noise about a couple things. One is that they are going to try to get into the exclusive game that Apple and Tidal have started, and they're also adding some video content as well through a couple different platforms. So let's look at some other revenue options, and then we'll have a chance to get to some more questions. But Aaron had asked me to just go over some other things besides streaming since we had this great panel here tonight. And they are great. Can you join me in expressing some early appreciation before this is over? Here's some global fun facts. At $3 billion, download volume was down 10.5%. That comprised 20% of industry revenue. This is looking all over the world, not just in the US. And although physical revenue continues to decline, it's still significant in such major markets as Germany, where it accounted for 60%. And at least as recently as 2014, it was 78% of the Japanese market. I don't have a number for them for 2015 yet. In the US, digital sales, 1 billion, down 14.9% in units, down 12.8% in dollars. Digital albums have also declined. So this is some of the impact of people going more toward the access model as opposed to owning music. Down 7% in units and 5.2% in dollars. Physical down 10.8%, even though people still buy CDs, to 144.2 million units. CDs declining 13.9%. That's a big number, but it's not as big as it was a few years ago. There was even bigger decline, and a 17% decline in dollars, which means that the fact that you have a bigger number in dollar decline means that people are paying less for CDs. That could include a lot of people buying cheaper catalog albums. Here's something that's been growing, vinyl sales. They've grown for at least 10 straight years. I was amused when I left Billboard in 2008. The last year I was there, I got a lot of calls from media, Time Magazine, CNN, different people who would call to get some expertise about the music industry. And I got more calls about vinyl, which in those days was less than 1% of the overall business, but it was growing. So it was kind of an affection for vinyl. But it's to the point now where if you took all the vinyl sales that happen at Universal Music, for instance, over the course of a year, it would be as large as a top 10 company who does business with Universal.
One thing to note, last year and this year we're on the same pace, that vinyl will equal in revenue what it generated in 1988. So it's made quite a comeback, and if 10 years ago somebody would have came up to me and said, we need to get back into the vinyl business, I would have thought they were crazy. But nowadays, we have artists where 10% of their revenue, or from their 10% of their sales, and a larger percent of their revenue is coming from a vinyl album. And that's not 10% of their physical, that's 10% of their overall coming from vinyl. And pressing plants can't keep up with the demand.
You can't get them made. It takes 16 weeks now.
Yep.
But the funny thing is that it directly relates to the last slide. Vinyl's become the premium format for all the values that it represents. You guys are probably pricing it, what, $24.98 for your vinyl? And for a frontline CD now, which not that many years ago would have been $18.98, you're getting, what, $13.98?
Yeah, about $13.98.
So so the CD version, which was the hot premium digital format not so long ago, is now the CD, and maybe you'll get $13.98, but people will happily pay $25 for it on vinyl. We got a question in the back, Jeff.
Yes. A couple things about that. I heard a story actually about a year ago about there being this cute little comeback on the part of cassettes. I would say two things. One is, even for all the growth we've seen with vinyl, I don't know if people are still quite certain why it continues to grow. I mean, a lot of people buy them for souvenirs. I think some of them never get played. But I don't know if anyone really has a good answer yet on why vinyl has done what it does. I think that with cassette, there's a kind of a novelty thing. It reminds people of the 80s.
And you can't discount nostalgia. For the act that appeals to that demographic, where the cassette was for a period of time the #1 format, when it had eclipsed vinyl, and before the CD really took hold as the format. I mean, it offered a lot of the attributes that digital music does. It was the most portable. You could play it anywhere you wanted to go. The Walkman boomed, so you could take it anywhere with you, walking around, or in your car, or in your house. The audio quality is not as good, and that's not going to change. But you know, if the dollars are there and the consumers vote with their wallets, there certainly are enough people experimenting with it that it's possible. I personally am trying to bring back the Edison disc. So for those of you who are college, you can look it up and find it.
I see it as being a boutique business.
I will add to that you know, there is a very large national chain, international chain, Urban Outfitters, who are carrying new cassettes, and Capitol is manufacturing cassettes for certain younger demographic artists like Halsey, Troye Sivan. We did one for Ryan Adams' 1989 take on Taylor Swift's record, and they've done quite well. Not numbers anywhere nearing what we've seen on vinyl, but I'll warn you, 10 years from now.
This is a slide that actually kind of combines two stories that we're talking. We're talking about the vinyl growth, and we're also talking about the disappointing revenue that comes in from ad-supported streaming. And here you can see that in 2015, I think this was from the RAAA report, in 2015 there were actually more revenue coming from vinyl sales than came from free Spotify and YouTube. And one last thing that we want you to keep in mind, and not everybody is Adele, I know this, but the fact that she could sell 3.3 million copies of an album indicates that people do still buy music. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. So now we're going to turn to some questions, and I have an eager person right here.
The vinyl, is that from a digital source, or are we going back to analog?
I think like anything else, it varies by how much the artist cares and pays attention and what they think the sales are. Generally, if it's a new album, I think you're probably going in and mastering both ways. The digital product, the digital master, has so greatly improved versus 20 years ago when they first started, where they were really horrible, that I think you'd be hard-pressed to tell in certain cases, but I think it varies project to project. The reality is that the translation back into vinyl, as people have become accustomed to longer albums, can be a complicated thing. People tend to, you know, a mature artist at this point, we're dealing with it with Neil McCoy, you know, they recorded the album, really they're still thinking CD, even though they know how important digital is. When they're making the record, they're thinking CD, the song list, the song stack, and the fact is the repertoire was difficult to then adapt to vinyl, and we're doing vinyl on that album. So it varies by the artist and how much attention's being paid and where it fits in their product plan. That touches on one point that I did want to raise. One of the things about all of this, as we're focused on streaming today, but what the paradigm shift has caused in terms of consumer and the product is that it isn't one thing anymore. And the record business is in a very unstable period of time, because in certain artists now, you literally can have 15 formats on a single album release when you're going out with it. When you include deluxe, standard, digital products, the various physical products. So that single release that maybe would have had one or two formats 5-10 years ago is now, you know, 5 times as complicated to bring to market. And so in each channel, you have to execute as well as you would have in 1 or 2 channels to be successful and to maximize your revenue.
Another thing to keep in mind about vinyl, I was talking to one of Vince's colleagues at one of the other Universal labels, and I'm sure this is true with you too. There are some developing acts, Vince, where you might come out digital and vinyl only and not even have a CD at the beginning of that artist's life.
Yeah, that's happening more and more now, especially with EDM artists. It makes more sense to make sure you had vinyl day and date with the digital release than having a CD made. So.
And Mara, when you talk to fellow publishers or when you talk to artists, any conversation about this nostalgic comeback by vinyl or by cassettes?
I mean, they like it because they get mechanical royalties. So, you know, they get more. I mean, most of the cassettes that I've seen have been not really so much appealing to people who bought cassettes the first time around. It's really mostly younger acts, and I see a lot of cassettes at shows for sale, in which case we probably wouldn't see much in the way of mechanicals anyway, but also most of the people who are selling those tapes write their own songs, and they're
Right.
just getting the money back anyway. But yeah, I mean, it's more lucrative for us than streaming on a per song basis for sure.
Any other questions about streaming or any of the other topics we've talked about? Over here, this gentleman's been patient. Yes, sir. Everyone hear that question? He wants to know if vinyl's a fad, and what was the second part of it? Yeah. Okay, well, let me do the second part first. When he talks about the different formats, that, there could be a deluxe and a standard edition. That's in CD alone, that would be 2 right there. And then that would be 2 more SKUs in the digital world. And then if Spotify had an interview added to it, that would be yet another configuration. So, it's not like things get diluted. It's just for the different offerings that you might have in the marketplace, that might happen.
What's become clearer and clearer is that it isn't, the opinion you've just voiced is typical and yet isn't the reflection of the entire audience. For a particular consumer, the best possible streaming product is absolutely the way to go, and streaming will continue to improve. And assuming that the revenue part gets solved, it will get better and better, and it'll be better served and better served. What's become clear is that there are multiple audiences in one release. That the price sensitivity, when you would sit down with a guy like Vince and you'd talk about a new album that's coming out, and they'd say, well, here's the feeling among the trade about pricing and where we think you should go with that. What's become clear is that there's probably 6 different legitimate answers to that. Each person who's interested in that project values that particular music in a different way. The casual listener who just listens to the radio the most and then might have bought 1 or 2 albums a year is probably fully going into streaming, and that's a massive audience. The artists that manage to get that person to convert and be 1 of the 2 albums they buy a year, that's when you'd get into the 10 million, 20 million in sales. For the pure hardcore fan, that's probably 5 to 10% of an artist's audience, what's become clearer and clearer is that they are a 35, 40% of an artist's revenue, and that super serving that audience with additional content, which takes a multitude of different representations, has become more and more important. That your portfolio of the ways that you sell a particular album, I don't think you're putting the cat back in the bag. I think that it's going to continue to be complicated, and it's going to require much more progressive administration from an artist and manager and record label point of view.
Vince?
Yeah, 2 things there. We still see the phenomenon of an album coming out and selling very well digitally first, whether that be streaming, download, or a combination of the 2 with a relatively small physical footprint. But as that release becomes more and more popular, we, over time, see a migration that goes more towards ownership and away from a more traditional consumption of via streaming or download. So we still see that to this day, especially as we get closer to the holidays. The other thing is, as Charlie mentioned, it's not one size fits all here. We have artists on our roster, as does every label, where 80% of their sales are still going to come from a physical release. Now, these are older artists, of course, who are just getting their feet wet in streaming. In fact, we had a presentation to one of our superstar artists on Capitol recently, kind of bringing him into the whole notion of streaming. And thankfully, he's very interested in pursuing and growing in that marketplace. But, and then we'll have other artists where 80% of it will come from streaming and downloads still to this day. So it's a fragmented market, and we have to continue to serve all those different revenue sources.
Two answers to your question about is it a fad. In the early 90s, I used to get, like, at the end of the year, I'd get calls from reporters, and they want to know about trends in the music industry. And one of, like, some frustrated middle-aged reporter would say to me, is this the year that rap's finally going to go away? You know, because they just found it annoying, and they didn't like it. And they just like, come on, it's a fad, right? And it's like, no, it's been around for 10, 15 years now. It's not going away. So in answer to your fad question, no, at the point where you get 10 years of growth and you see the numbers that we showed you, and it's making more money than one of the, you know, real popular buckets of money or consumption, no, that's no longer a fad. When I first joined Universal, one of the bosses that Vince and I had referred to vinyl sales as a rounding error. And within a few years, you would no longer have characterized it in that manner.
I think you have to look at the values. Certainly, in the first few years, that was everybody's thought. Oh, this is a funny fad. This will go away. There'll be a new thing in a few years. But the interesting thing is that what a vinyl album represents and how that relates to a digital album, I think relates to how you fall in love with a record or a piece of music. And it's larger, it's physical, and it's analog, and all of its values are contrary to the way the world generally operates.
And the people who love it really love it. You know, like, I don't know how many of you listen to Mark Maron's podcast. That guy, I think he will only listen to vinyl, you know? So, yeah.
It's all over the place.
It's all over yeah, they're really not, that's one of the unanswered questions. Remember I told you earlier, we're not quite sure why it's growing, we just know that it's growing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At the same time, though, Steinway sells a $10,000 turntable every day. The audiophile has not gone away. There is a passionate audiophile audience that believes that no matter FLAC or whatever other digital format you bring, it's not as good as a quality vinyl pressing. And there's nothing more boring. It's like dogs hearing to me, to get into a room of audio engineers and debate the relative size and the weight of the vinyl versus the slowness of the master cutting. I have these conversations all the time, and I swear it's given me half the gray hair I have. But the reality is that at the same time, people are spending $10,000 for the ultimate turntable. It's a great business for them. Doesn't take a lot when you're doing them at $10,000 a piece.
But obviously that's still a niche audience. You know, I mean, someone's willing to. You can't think of the LP now the way that you thought about it in 1988. You know, because it was a mass product, both in terms of the software and the hardware. Vince, you had another thought?
Yeah, I just want to say that you make a very good point about the record players, I won't call them a turntable, that Urban Outfitters sells. And that's skewed towards their younger demographic. And I think as an industry, that's a good entry point for a 13-year-old consumer who's only lived experiencing music on their phone or on a tablet on YouTube, to introduce them to a physical, as Charlie said, something tactile, something that brings them closer to the artist than a small little picture on a phone. And that's serving one segment of that market. And believe it or not, Urban Outfitters sells a lot of catalog. They're going back and experiencing albums of kind of the way that they were originally made to be experienced, you know, whether it be Beatles catalog or whomever. But a lot of what Urban Outfitters sells is seminal catalog from the 60s and 70s.
We have
to that young demo.
We have a couple questions here, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. Go ahead. He wants to know, with instant gratification that happens in streaming, has the value of the album decreased? And
the answer is yes and no. No, I mean, there are still some projects. Adele is an album. You know, people don't break that up because you can't break it up. It's not available in broken up format. So people who consume that consume the whole pie. But there will be some artists that Vince sells, and some artists that Charlie sells, and some artists that Mara publishes, whose audience skew more physical. We talked about Germany and Japan being more physical. Certain artists are more album-oriented. So, you know, the other thing to think about is that people look at an album in a different way than they used to. It used to be, this is the album, and I'm reluctant to put a single out in the market because I'm afraid I'll sell fewer albums. But now, people are looking at the album in other ways. Now the songs that I sell from an album or the songs that I stream from an album are more money that album brought in, that those individual song contributions wouldn't exist if the album didn't exist to begin with. So that's part of it. The other part of it is when I look at new releases that come out every week, an increasing number of them are EPs. I mean, it could be that if you look at the releases that sell enough to enter the top 1,000 each week, I'd say that maybe close to half of them, if not more, in any given week are EPs as opposed to LPs. So a lot of artists, many of them younger ones, but a lot of artists are looking more to have something that doesn't take as much time to record and can get into the consumer's hands quicker.
If you look at the pattern of consumer demand historically, you always had a higher conversion level as you added more hit singles to the album purchase, certainly in pop music. It's different in rock. Rock traditionally was an album concept. I think hip-hop is all over the place depending on what artist you're talking about. And the reality is that I don't think that fundamental impulse has changed. I think that if I hear a single I really like, Nathaniel Rateliff comes to my mind. You know, you hear a single you really like, then you hear a second song, then you hear a third song, and you're like, wow, this guy's really good. I want that album because everything I hear is good. If it's a single, it's like, I love that song. I remember when I was starting in the business, I had friends who worked with Hall & Oates. And Hall & Oates struggled for 10 years when they were having great hit singles was to convert people to buy albums. They tended to lag in album sales despite the fact that they were having a phenomenal singles run. And that was the struggle to get somebody to fall in love with them as an artist and a vision in a larger sense. There were other artists that's innate to what they do.
And we had one other question here, and then we're going to wrap it up. Yes, sir.
I also heard from, Billboard, is that the Switzerland futurist speaker, and he said that the big problem is just that streaming is too expensive. He said that it should be $2 or $3, and he was talking about the Netflix model. Like he said, oh, I can get all the movie that I want for like $7, $8, and it's a no-brainer. It's like you don't even think about it. And I'm saying that because I still have some friends who would say it's too expensive to spend $10 on music. I think it's crazy, but at the end of the day.
Okay, let me argue with this person, not you, the person you're quoting. First of all, the notion that $10 is too much, you know, depending on what you get in your cable bill, you could be paying $150 easily. If you're getting all the sports channels and you're getting ESPN and the other, HBO and the other premium movie channels, you're easily paying $150 or something like that. So
A month,
yeah. So $10 a month.
not a year.
I'm sorry.
$120 a year gets you
Yeah.
unlimited music streaming.
In the information age, having a take in any subject makes you money. I become better known as a futurist if I say something that's against the trend of whatever particular area that I'm commenting on. You know, I happen to think that futurists are overpaid and that he should work for half the money that he's working for because I think his ideas are basically hot air just to satisfy his ego and give him a bigger name. But that's just me.
Mara?
There also seems to be this perception that just because a creative work is audio only, that it is somehow worth less than an audio visual work. You know, well, you know, it's okay to pay $150 a month for TV shows, you know, for streaming shows, but if it's just music, then, oh, it's like barely worth anything. And the other thing is it's a completely different model how the creators are compensated on Netflix. The creators aren't getting paid per viewing or per stream. They sell their show to Netflix and then they can stream it as much as they want. So they're a lot freer to charge what they want without having to worry about paying the creators a royalty. So it's a lot easier to do an all-you-can-eat type
and
model.
there's a lot of content that Netflix has that's available as a they still do the discs, and there's an awful lot of movies that you can't.
A shocking amount.
For all the streaming you can do at Netflix, including all their great original programming, there's an awful lot of great movies that you can't get through streaming.
And just
so.
to point out another flaw in this genius's opining, the reality is that Netflix so needs compelling content that they are paying the best rates in Hollywood to create new content to drive you to their service. So the reality is that in the marketplace, they are paying the best rates. And so it isn't really the sources that he's drawing his opinion on, he's not really correct on his observations of how those sources work.
Other than that, what he said was brilliant.
Oh, that we loved him. We love him. He's a great guy. I want to buy his book.
So listen, I know that those of you who were students here are getting into finals, and for you to take this much time it really shows a great commitment to you learning more, and I appreciate that, especially any of you who might be in the marketing budgeting class that starts first week of July, because I'll be getting to know you better. And please join me in thanking Charlie and Mara and Vince in a really, really informative discussion.